Hidden Messages in Beatles Films, Number 1, A Hard Day's Night. This video is about the hidden messages, predictive programming, and propaganda within the first Beatles film, A Hard Day's Night. Going back to examine this film is a little nostalgic for me, because this is where my own Beatles story started, by watching the Beatles films in chronological order. I was 6.5 at the time, and I knew nothing else about the Beatles beyond these films. In 1987, they were being promoted again, off the back of the 20th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper. Each Beatles film had its own purpose. A Hard Day's Night was mostly a propaganda campaign. Its aim was to encourage adults into the Beatles cult. By 1964, the deep state had already captured the attention of the children, especially teenagers. Now they had to invade the hearts and minds of the adults and seduce them into the Beatles myth. They might not want to attend a concert full of screaming girls, but people of all ages go to the cinema. At the beginning of the film, the programming for the masses starts straight away. Rather than having the Beatles taken by a private vehicle to their TV appearances or concerts, the film starts by making them run down a street in order to catch a train, whilst being chased by a large group of screaming fans. What is the point of this? It's to make you, the audience, understand that the Beatles are very popular, totally fab in fact, and this is the sort of behaviour that is expected of you in your response to them. Whilst John, George and Ringo try to sneak their way to the train by hiding in photo booths and telephone kiosks, Paul and his grandfather, John McCartney, hide behind newspapers in a mad parody of a spy film. With a touch of clairvoyance, Paul dons a fake moustache, just as Billy will when he replaces him on the artwork for Sgt. Pepper. After the screaming fans along the train platform fade out of sight, the Beatles find themselves in a carriage with Paul's grandfather, and the other Beatles wonder why he's there. I've watched this film dozens of times, and I don't know why he's there either. His rather contrived raison d'etre is to be a plot device and foil alongside the Beatles. He's a villain, without which nothing much would happen in this film. There's a running joke about him being a very clean old man, in sharp contrast to the dirty old man that the actor Wilfrid Bramble normally played in Steptoe and Son. But actually, that isn't quite true. Here he is looking at a copy of Men's Only, and Paul describes him in the film as a mixer and a troublemaker. After Grandfather McCartney is taken off by the Beatles' entourage for coffee, the Beatles find their train carriage infiltrated by a well-suited city worker type, who clearly objects to their presence. He repeats that he takes this train regularly and fought a war for these scoundrels, so that should mean he should get his own way, i.e., the windows should be shut, no music should be played, and they should not be in his way. The Beatles protest that there are more of them, and in a democracy, that should matter. We're a community. Majority vote, up the workers, and all that stuff, says Paul in a subtle flurry of Fabianism. The older man replies that they should take themselves and their radio to some other part of the train, where they obviously belong. Paul and John stand their ground at first, and John even cheekily asks the man to "giz a kiss." Eventually they realise that you can't win with his sort, as John puts it. After all, it's his train, isn't it, mister? John states sarcastically, as they retreat to the buffet carriage. What do we learn from this altercation? On one level, it's a division between generations and people of different class backgrounds. The audience is meant to feel sympathy for the young, working-class Beatles being castigated by a miserly, older, middle-class man who feels that his rights outweigh all of theirs. At a deeper level, the audience is being shown that the older man's mode of thinking is outdated. The Beatles are right, and their modern approach is the way forward in society. The audience should follow their lead. Also, John's public character as the witty, sardonic, and cheeky one starts to be cemented with this scene. In fact, most people's views of the Beatles' characters were, to some extent, set into place by this film. Once the Beatles arrive safely at the TV studios where they are due to perform, we see them in their own private green room. Paul sits at a piano that just happens to have a ceramic figure of a ram placed on it. And here's a better image from the continuity shot. As we pull focus on Paul, his head and the ram's head are side by side. The ram is traditionally associated with sacrifice, and so this image could well be one of the earliest images that predicts Paul's death and replacement. Also note the Pentax camera, with which the real Paul was meant to have taken his fabled personal photographs within the eye of the storm of Beatlemania. Next, we are shown mountain piles of fan mail. Each of the Beatles receives armfuls of letters, followed by an instruction to answer each letter at the threat of receiving no downtime whatsoever if they don't. The Beatles groan at this, which is meant to solicit both sympathy for the way that they are being worked so hard, and also awe that they receive so much fan mail in the first place. And why do they get so much fan mail? Because they're the fabulous Beatles, of course. In another backstage room, the Beatles roadies are stressing over their own jobs. At this point, we have an early example of product placement, with a view of John's first book, in his own right, on the mantelpiece. Next, the film comprises of 3 cameo-styled scenes that centre around each of the Beatles. It's interesting to note that Paul doesn't really get one of these scenes, as his account is woven so tightly into the narrative of his grandfather's that Paul almost ends up being an extra in his own life story. In the DVD extras for the film, the crew state that Paul was uncomfortable with acting, so he was given the least to do. That might be true, but it's also convenient to the controllers, because his hazy characterization allows Billy to easily take up the role of Paul where the real Paul left off without being noticed. John's scene is a comedy of errors. Backstage, he is repeatedly told by a passing actress that he looks just like him, although, for comedy reasons, we are never told who he actually looks like. After donning her glasses, she eventually realizes her error. No, she decides, "You don't look like him at all." John is clearly upset by this and retreats. Beyond the humour, what is the point of this scene? Is it a sly jab at the Beatles fans, who regularly mistake the Beatles doubles for the originals? Next comes my favourite scene of A Hard Day's Night, which centres on George with a marketing guru. This advertising man thinks he has his finger on the pulse of what is trending, yet he utterly fails to recognise who George Harrison is at the height of Beatlemania. I love this scene, because if we push past the humour, we get to have a glimpse of how trends are set and people are manipulated into following them. Those same people believe that it was the will of ordinary individuals that brought those trends into existence, rather than the truth, which is that they were deliberately put into place by a handful of people plotting around a desk. I've included just the audio of this scene with the screenshots to get around the copyright issues. I'll comment on the scene after it's played.
Simon, will this do?
Well, not bad, darling, not really bad. Turn around, cheeky baby. Oh, yes, he's a definite boss. He'll look good alongside Susan. All right, Sammy Jim, this is all going to be quite painless. Don't breathe on me, Adrian.
I'm terribly sorry, but there seems to be some sort of misunderstanding.
Oh, you can come off it with us. You don't have to do all the old adenoidal glottal stop and carry on for our benefit.
I'm afraid I don't understand.
Oh, my God, he's a natural.
Well, I did tell them not to send us real ones.
They ought to know by now the phonies are much easier to handle. Still, he's a good type. We'd like you to give us your opinion on some clothes for teenagers.
Oh, by all means, I'd be quite prepared for that eventuality.
Well, not your real opinion, naturally. It'll be written out and you'll learn it. Can you read?
Of course I can.
I mean lines, Ducky. Can you handle lines?
Well, I'll have a bash.
Good. Give him whatever it is they drink. A Coca-Rama?
So?
Well, at least he's polite. Show him the shirts, Adrian. Now, you'll like these. You'll really dig them. They're fab and all the other pimply hyperboles.
I wouldn't be seen dead in them. The dead grotty.
Grotty?
Yeah, grotesque.
Make a note of that word and give it to Susan. It's rather touching, really. Here's this kid trying to give me his utterly valueless opinion when I know for a fact that within a month he'll be suffering from a violent inferiority complex and loss of status because he isn't wearing one of these nasty things. Of course they're grotty, you wretched nit. That's why they were designed, but that's what you'll want.
I won't.
You can be replaced, chickie baby.
I don't care.
That pose is out too, Sonny Jim. The new thing is to care passionately and be right-wing. Anyway, if you don't cooperate, you won't meet Susan.
And who's this Susan when she's at home?
Only Susan Campy, our resident teenager. You'll have to love her. She's your symbol.
Oh, you mean that posh bird who gets everything wrong?
I beg your pardon.
Oh, yeah, the lads frequently sit round the television and watch her for a giggle. In fact, once we all sat down, wrote these letters saying how gear she was and all that rubbish.
She's a trendsetter. It's her profession.
She's a drag, a well-known drag. We turn the sound down on her and say rude things.
Get him out of here.
Have I said something amiss?
Get him out. He's knocking the program's image.
Sorry about the shirt.
Get him out! You don't think he's a new phenomenon, do you?
You mean an early clue to the new direction?
Where's the calendar? Oh, no. It's all right. He's just a troublemaker. The change isn't due for 3 weeks yet. All the same, make a note not to extend Susan's contract. Let's not take any unnecessary chances.
So that was the scene. A few things to note. The line, "the phonies are easier to handle," is wonderful. It says so much in just a few words. They are telling the audience that the world of advertising is full of phonies. George is required to memorize a scripted opinion and pass it off as his own. This practice seems obvious now, but maybe it was less obvious to the audience at the time. George is instructed that he should love the trendsetter, Susan, because she's his symbol. "Oh, you mean the posh bird who gets everything wrong?" decries George. "She's the trendsetter. It's her profession," retorts the marketing guru. Susan is what we would now refer to as an influencer. She is loved by the marketing guru 1 minute and thickly lined up to be dropped in the next. According to the commentary track on the 50th anniversary DVD of A Hard Day's Night, this scene includes the first documented use of the word grotty, which was purportedly Liverpool slang in the 1960s. So George is being used as a trendsetter himself here. Also take note of George's accent. He probably had the broadest Liverpool accent of the 4 Beatles. Notice how he says the word drag with an almost rolled R. That Liverpool R is notoriously hard to imitate. It was one of the reasons that Billy always stood out for me. His fake accent is good, but Billy never imitates that R sound properly. Now let's consider the background. The faces within pentagrams and sunburst images behind the marketing guru's desk hint at occult imagery, while the statue of Britannia reminds us of the British invasion. I was a teenager in the 90s, and I remember images of Britannia also being used in advertising during the contrivance that was Britpop. In the rehearsal for the TV studio performance of And I Love Her, we see Paul being quite literally hexed by standing on a black hexagonal platform with another one just behind him. By contrast, everyone else stands on or near a white hexagon. This is just one of many instances where Paul is singled out over the whole of the Beatles' career. This scene became the template for the filming of music videos for the next few decades. This is especially true of the lighting. As the camera circles all the way around Paul, it catches the arc light and overexposes the shot. Continuing on, we see this shot with Paul's profile, framed with a halo. It's almost as if they wanted him to look angelic or otherworldly. In the makeup room before going on stage, we hear the Beatles questioning the makeup assistants. "You won't interfere with the rugged concept of my personality, will you?" Meanwhile, Ringo has borrowed a Beefeater's headpiece and has sat down under a hood-styled hairdryer to read a magazine called The Queen. John breaks the fourth wall and tells the audience straight to the camera, "That's an in-joke, you know." What sort of joke is it? A gay joke, with a hint at the social engineering with regards to sexuality that is about to follow? Or the fact that the monarchy are in on the Beatles scheme to be the biggest band in the world? Bear in mind that this film was shot only about a year before they received their MBEs from the Queen. The camera takes us on a journey between studios to see what acts are also being recorded for TV. One brief scene shows us Lionel Blair and some female dancers learning a routine in front of large images of insects, at least two of which look like beetles. Is this a sly reference to the scarab beetles of Egyptian mythology? Meanwhile, Grandfather McCartney gets into trouble for fraudulently gaining access to a gambling club, posing as someone else and stealing someone else's winnings to make yet more bets. All of this is passed off as good humour because the club owners are fooled into thinking that Grandfather McCartney is a rich aristocrat. This speaks volumes about the kind of behaviour that is acceptable if you are one of the elites in the club. If anyone else did that, they'd be in jail. After the Beatles and their entourage pay off the staggering bill that he has racked up, Ringo takes him off to a cafe to keep him out of yet more criminal activity. As they sit there with their drinks, Ringo is reading a book. According to the commentary track on the 50th anniversary DVD of A Hard Day's Night, the book he is reading is Anatomy of a Murder. A curious title, considering the future fates of his fellow band members. Also note that the time on the clock behind them is 10 to 6. Is this a reference to the price tag of 10 and 6 on the hat of the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland? Certainly, the same time turns up later in Sgt. Pepper's Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. The band begins at 10 to 6 when Mr. K performs his tricks without a sound. In this cafe scene, Grandfather McCartney persuades Ringo to go off parading. He repeatedly questions Ringo's manliness and his boring life choices. He goads Ringo into action by telling him that he could be out there, portraying a rich American widow or sipping palm wine in Tahiti before he's too old, adding that they've driven you into books with their cruel, unnatural treatment, exploiting your good nature. Riled up by his put-downs and excited by the prospects in front of him, Ringo abandons his responsibilities to both Grandfather McCartney and the Beatles as a whole to go off parading around the town, doing whatever he likes. One of the first things he does is to buy a cheap coat and hat as a quick disguise and slinks off to the pub. After getting thrown out of the pub for troublemaking, he finds himself down by the river with his camera. He tries to take a selfie, which is commonplace now, but a fairly new phenomena in 1964. Also, note his Masonic pose. By the river, Ringo meets a boy of about 10. He says he's not in school because he's a deserter, and he has decided to blow school out with his friends. The boy asks Ringo why he's not at work. "I'm a deserter too," replies Ringo, as they start throwing things into the river. So, what is the point of Ringo's day of parading? It's to signal a subtle message. Don't go to school, Don't go to work. Do whatever you want to do, and to hell with everything else. This is exactly in line with the ideas of the incoming Aeon of Horus. The message is mild, but at this stage it had to be. If this film were made now, Ringo might be speeding down a highway, the wrong way, in a stolen car, casually drive-by shooting, and having sex in a room full of high-class hookers whilst high as a kite. But not in 1964. You might say I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. What I just described is a run-of-the-mill Hollywood movie now. But how did that sort of activity become a standard in filmmaking? It started around 60 years ago, very innocently but insidiously, with ideas like parading, and slowly crept up from there. Grandfather McCartney finally gets arrested for selling fake autographed photos of the Beatles and causing a frenzy outside a concert venue. This, of course, is an irony, since the Beatles' roadies claim to have frequently signed photos on behalf of the Beatles to help them get through their fan mail quicker. Grandfather McCartney's roguish character does not portray the Irish in a good light. He is not Liverpool Irish, he is actually Irish. His character is like a grotesque caricature of an Irishman from a 1960s English perspective. Typically, from my own experience, there were mainly two stereotypes of Irish people in England. They were either regarded as nice, friendly, but ultimately stupid, or clever, but devious and often criminal. And either type was also likely to drink too much. I'm not saying that such people don't exist. I'm saying that Grandfather McCartney's character is deliberately that of an Irish villain, with no redeemable features whatsoever, which is completely unrealistic. At the police station, Grandfather McCartney starts to rant about the brutality of the British state. He starts to talk about Irish independence and even starts to sing the 1840s rebel song, A Nation Once Again. I have to ask, what does any of this have to do with the plotline of a comedy film based on a day in the life of the Beatles? Why is it there? I'm going to tread gently into what I know is a very sensitive subject and ask this question. Is the purpose of his behaviour as a rogue Irishman in England to reinforce stereotypical views and thereby stir up trouble and mistrust between the British and the Irish? I think it's worth considering. My father was Irish. He came to London at the end of the 1950s, when many windows displayed posters reading, "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish." In the 1960s, there was already ill feeling between these two nations, but in the decades that followed, that tension became quite literally explosive. This film was made in 1964. 8 years later, in 1972, the horrifying events of Bloody Sunday took place. Billy quickly wrote a song about it called "Give Ireland Back to the Irish." John Lennon followed his lead by writing similar songs on his album Sometime in New York. Billy devotes an entire chapter of his memoirs to the topic of Irish independence. At the beginning of that chapter, he states that the purpose of its inclusion is, and I quote, "to increase awareness of the plight of the Irish and the plague of rigid thinking." I want to believe him, but I'm not sure that I do. I will tell you a personal story. I have dual nationality. I hold both a British and Irish passport, and I have family based in both countries, including near the border in Donegal. When I started school in 1985, we sat in a circle and started to introduce ourselves to each other. Other children talked about their parents. I mentioned that my father was Irish. The boy across from me leaned over and asked me, in all sincerity, if I was a member of the IRA. We were 5 years old, but already that boy had a view of what Irishness meant, and it meant being a terrorist. That wasn't an accident. He had been programmed to think like that. In the years that followed, I was to learn that, if you grow up in England, you will learn nothing about Ireland, its history, or its culture at school. If you grow up in Ireland, you will learn everything about the British. I think this deliberate ignorance was engineered to stop the British, and in particular the English, from understanding the situation properly. This follows on from a similar principle, that it's easier to kill people when you dehumanize your enemy. I know that this has been a very heavy subject, but I felt I had to include it. I'm very suspicious of Grandfather McCartney's characterization and the inclusion of this scene in a film that is clearly a tool of deep state propaganda in every other sense. But let's move on. Ringo is also arrested for disturbing the peace and meets Grandfather McCartney at the police station just before the old rebel makes his break for freedom. A Keystone Cops-like scene follows, with the Beatles trying to get hold of Ringo to bring him back to the theatre in time for their performance. The backdrop to the Beatles concert is interesting. Each of the Beatles is photographed in such a way to make them look like Hindu gods, with many heads, arms, and legs. Consider how much Indian culture is going to matter to the Beatles over the following 2 years. The next Beatles film, Help, made in 1965, which I'll talk about in my next video, was going to be called 8 Arms to Hold You, and features a cult dedicated to Kali. Then, after Paul died, the Beatles go to India to learn how to communicate with the spirit of Paul. Near the end of the film, we see the Beatles play a genuine concert. Footage of the crowd starts by showing close-ups of cute-looking girls in quiet awe of their idols. Soon the camera starts to move faster and faster, circling and zooming in and out, until the picture starts to blur. The audio track is now filled with the excited screams of their fans. By this point, the girls start to look more upset and even crazed, as the hysteria of Beatlemania is on full display. Again, just as with the chase scene at the start of the film, the audience is being programmed, maybe even brainwashed, into the same behavior. On the commentary track of the 50th anniversary DVD of A Hard Day's Night, the crew refers to this girl as the White Rabbit. As the picture cuts back and forth to her, we watch her get more emotionally involved with the Beatles. Her final shot is of her simpering the name George over and over whilst crying, as though it deeply pained her to not be in his life. To prevent him from running off and committing any more crimes, Grandfather McCartney is handcuffed to one of the Beatles' roadies during this concert. Despite this, he still somehow manages to escape. As we look down at his empty theatre seat, we realise that he was sitting in seat number 9, a number which is constantly associated with Paul McCartney throughout the Beatles' later work and in Billy's memoirs. As the Beatles walk off stage, they are told that they immediately have to push on to another concert, and a private helicopter has been sent to collect them. What is the message here? That at a time when airline travel was still rare for ordinary people, the Beatles are so important that they get to travel by private helicopter. This is a minor lapse in logic, of course, because if that was the case, then why did they travel on a public train at the start of the film? The film credits conclude with a little one-eyed symbolism from Paul. No doubt this was a direction from the Cabal in their homage to Horus and Ra in Egyptian mythology. So, that was my rundown of the hidden messages in A Hard Day's Night. Despite everything I've just said, oddly, I still like this film, although I admit that's probably just nostalgia. The Beatles channeled the humour of the Marx Brothers and the Goons in this film, and that still brings a smile to my face, even though perhaps it shouldn't. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.